If you have no idea how to play against the London system, keep watching. But if you really want to make their life miserable, watch till the very end. Hi there, this is Dr. Siddharth Yadav, and in this episode of Chess for Pandas, we will continue to look at our Beat the London System series. So, without further ado, let's get into it. After d4, d5, bishop f4 is where our London system starts. And in the previous video, we covered the line c5, e3, knight c6, c3, bishop, queen b6, b3, c4, and now we covered the move queen takes b6 here, where I showed you all the lines where black is getting a fantastic strategic game by opening up the a file and then pushing the pawn with a lot of piece pressure in the center. But today we are not going to look at any of that because white's most popular move is queen c2. And over here, let me tell you something that we want to do, but let me show you a way how to do it in a really bad way. So what we want to do here is offer this insane piece sacrifice with bishop f5. Now the idea is quite simple. We would want the queen to take, so our own queen can take on b2, and then obviously chop up the rook on a1. That's basically our idea. But the problem is, in this exact position, bishop f5 is not a good move. Why? Because after takes, and we take back, we are threatening the rook now. Queen takes d5, queen takes a1. Now comes this fantastic move by white, which is queen b5. Now queen b5 does two things. It kind of traps our queen. The reason being the knight is now protected. It attacks our pawn on b7, and the queen exactly can't really move out. If it tries to move out via a2, they take via queen b7, and they're attacking both the pieces. Let's say rook d8 after takes, c8, d8, b7. They have managed to take our knight and also go back and protect their own knight. And I don't really think that this position is good for black. In fact, it's very close to just outright losing. We have no development whatsoever on the black king side. The black's king is very open. The queen, although, can come to the defense, but this is not the kind of position that we want to play for black. Very horrible, very horrible. So there could be a possibility of just castling queenside, but after bishop takes c4, it's already problematic. Now the queen cannot come out by taking on e2, by taking on a2. And let's say we try to get aggressive and try to open up our bishop with bishop takes e5, b takes e5, and now this tricky move, knight b4, which actually prevents the queen from looking at the knight, and now the knight is being attacked. But simply bishop d3, and I don't think black has anything better than knight takes d3, queen takes d3, queen takes a2, knight f3, f6, trying to kick the bishop, bishop b6, bishop d6, castle, knight e7. You have to develop the knight to connect the rooks, and c4. Yeah, this is not a good position for black. I also think that it's very close to losing, if not losing. White has these amazing open A and B files to attack the black king. The black king is very airy, open, and these light squares here, we don't have a light squared bishop to patch up all of these holes. Also, white is down in exchange, but he has a pawn for it, pawn and a piece for it. So I don't really think that white is also down in a lot of material. And these pawns are very mobile. And if they start pushing, they're going to cramp us even further for space. And I don't really think that we should go for this position. So the thing is, if bishop f5 is such a bad move in this position, why is it that it is the most common move in this position? In this position, the most common move is bishop f5. And why is that so? And I've seen even grandmasters, you can find in the database, even grandmasters have played this move, bishop f5. Now, why is that the case? Now, I'll tell you why this happens. Is because in another version of London, where they don't go bishop f4 immediately after d4, d5, but instead go knight f3, and we go knight f6, and then everything happens the same way. Bishop f4, c5, e3, knight c6, c3, queen b6, queen b3, c4, queen c2. And over here, bishop f5 is actually the best move. And the reason for that is if you take the bishop and we take the pawn, the queen doesn't have this queen takes d5 maneuver and then queen to b5, because our knight is actually protecting the d5 square. Sorry, our knight is actually protecting the d5 square. So there's no queen takes d5. And in this variation, yes, white is lost. So that's the reason why a lot of players mistake this position after queen takes b2 with this position where the knights are not there. There's a huge difference between this and this. The main difference being the knight not protecting this pawn. So this is the main reason why bishop f5 is being played, because they think the same ideas work there, but they don't. This little detail of the knight protecting the d5 pawn is very important. So now you know why bishop f5 in this position doesn't really work, although it's pretty good, but it doesn't really work. The idea is pretty good, but it doesn't work in this position. So what should we do? Well, we have to play this amazing sacrifice, e5. Now, what is the idea behind this move, e5? The thing is, after, let's say, bishop takes e5, bishop f5, queen takes, and after we take back, the queen is not looking at the d5 square. So there's no queen takes d5 because of the bishop in the middle. So that's the main idea of e5. And now, similarly to the knight f3 lines and knight f3, knight f6 lines, the queen still can't take this particular pawn. Now, this time because the bishop is in between. So this is the main reason why we play e5. Now, there are two moves here. One is bishop takes, and the other one is pawn takes e5. In this video, we are going to have a look at bishop takes e5. In the next video, we'll have a look at the pawn takes d5. A lot of the variations are very similar. They have very similar themes, but obviously the bishop takes e5 variation also has its own flavor. So let's look at this one first. Now, after bishop takes e5, obviously we go for our plan with bishop f5. Now, over here, the most common move is queen c1. But let's first look at what happens after queen takes f5, which is a bad move. So after queen takes f5, queen takes b2. We already know that the queen can't take the d5 pawn. So this position should be winning for black. But I have seen black players mess this up big time and lose. Now I'll tell you why that's the case. Let's go with a tricky move, which is knight f3. Obviously, the rook cannot be protected, so the white basically says, okay, I'm gonna let it drop. And now over here, we should resist our temptation of immediately grabbing the rook. And that's the problem, because black really wants to get rid of that rook, wants to cash in, and that's the problem. If you take the rook and the queen is already on this diagonal, the queen actually can drop back to c2. And now our queen is kind of trapped. It cannot take the knight, it cannot take the pawn, it cannot come out via b2 right now. So that's why the queen is trapped. Playing bishop a3 to get a support square for the queen doesn't work because of bishop takes g7. So we are losing a rook. We are losing our own rook in this position. So kind of ironic, but we can't really do bishop a3 right now. One thing that we can try is, let's say, f6. The bishop goes back, and now we can try bishop a3. But unfortunately, white has this very strong move, which is e4. And I'll just give you a sample line to demonstrate the kind of dangers that lurk here for black position. So let's say after d takes e4, knight d2, f2, they are already protecting the knight now, and they are threatening to take our c4 pawn. Let's say after b5, they can actually sack their knight for the pawn. Knight takes e4, b takes e4, bishop takes e4. Now white is just about to castle here. Let's say knight g7, castle. And now the real threat is simply capturing the bishop, and there will be a discovered attack on the queen. So queen b2, and after queen takes e4, I don't like this position at all for black. The bishops actually make castling either side very problematic. Well, you can't really castle on the king side because of the bishop on c4. And even if you castle queenside, I don't really see how black is going to survive this kind of an attack. So we understand that immediately taking queen takes a1 is not good. So what do? The best move in this position is basically knight g to e7. Now there is no particular square on this diagonal where the queen can go to safely. So the queen probably has to go somewhere like queen h5. And now again, we have to resist our temptation of immediately capturing, although it's not bad in this position after the queen has moved. There is no queen c2 now. So capturing the rook immediately is okay. It's a decent move. But I'm just going to show you a little finesse that you should probably not ignore in this position. And that is to go queen c1 first. There's no piece that can interpose the check. So the king has to move up. And now the bishop is blocked because the king is basically on e2. Now we give the check again. And now let's say the white knight blocks, which is the most obvious move. Now we take the rook. And now here in this position, we have actually blocked their bishop. So it will take them, I believe, a few more moves to get the bishop out. And that's the reason why taking the rook immediately was also good. But this little finesse is slightly better. So after queen takes a1, let's just try to see what white can do, what shouldn't probably work. So knight g5, they're threatening something on f7. We go knight g6, g3, that's okay. We keep chopping the pawns, bishop g2, queen d3, e1, c3, and here is this tricky bishop takes d5, which shouldn't really work, and it doesn't. C takes d2 is the most simplest, king d1, and now just knight c takes e5. Obviously the point being, if you take, we have queen takes d5 here. So I don't really think that this position deserves any more commentary, but you should refrain from taking the rook straight after the first try. So after knight f3, you should refrain from taking the rook in this position. So if not knight f3, there are some other moves that have been tried. One crazy line is this bishop takes g7. Now the idea is, after we take back, which we should, queen takes d5, and now white wants to enter those same lines with queen d5 and queen b6 here. But there's a huge difference in this position, and the difference is after queen takes a1, queen b5, knight g to e7, and there isn't a bishop here, so they're lacking a bishop in this particular position. So even after something like bishop c4, we can simply castle, and I don't really see any danger for black. After something like knight e2, now the threat is essentially to castle and play knight a6, because the knight on e2 is actually protecting the c3 pawn. Here comes a6, trying to dislodge the queen from the protection of the knight. There are several things that white can try, but queen b3 should not work because of knight a5. The queen comes and knight takes. And now the queen can't keep control of both. So if they take the knight, they lose their own knight. So one thing that they can try is, let's say, castle, and we just take the pawn on a2 and come out, and while protecting our own knight. So that shouldn't really be a problem. Queen b3. They can go directly for queen takes b7, but after rook a b8, I don't really see what they can do, because the queen is actually kind of pinned to the knight now. And I mean, okay, you can take, but there's nothing here. You can obviously just come out like this. That shouldn't be a problem. Let's say queen takes a6. We take the knight, so this isn't a good position. The best they can do is queen b6, but after the other knight comes back to vacate the queen, queen takes b7 in this position still runs into that same issue. Let's say they actually chop the rook off, but we can still escape in the previous, just like the previous variation. And after something like queen takes c6, rook b1, it's all the same. So I don't really think that white's queen position can remain on the b file protecting the b1 knight. So this is the reason why this bishop takes g7 line tries to transpose to the other line, but it doesn't really work. A final try in this position could be knight e2. Same thing, you don't really want to capture it immediately because of this. So here again, I suggest that we play knight g to e7, and after the queen drops back, let's say h5, h3, now we take. So it's all the same, very similar to the knight f3 variation. Now, if after bishop f5, queen can't really take, what else can they go? Well, they can move the queen. Moving to a5 is kind of useless because you're letting go of your b2 pawn for no reason. Moving to d2 is possible, but then you are stepping on the toes of this knight, and then the knight will have to develop via a3, and I don't really think that it wants to do that. So the best move here, while protecting the b2 pawn, is queen c1, and we're going to have a look at that next. So after queen c1, here we should capture the knight, capture the bishop with the knight. Knight takes e5, and after d takes e5, here is where we actually convert this into a gambit with the move f6. Now, the idea behind this is white is actually behind in development, and black wants to open up the lines towards the king and try to attack as soon as possible. Now, I'm considering three moves here. So one of the moves being, the most principal being e takes f6. The other one is e6, trying to decline the pawn. And the other way to basically decline the pawn is knight to f3. So I'm considering three moves here. The main line actually runs with e takes f6. So let's look at that one first. So after e takes f6, we have to capture back, knight f3, bishop c5. Now it may look odd putting the bishop on a diagonal which is actually blocked. It's like chewing on granite at the moment, but we'll see that the reason why bishop comes to c5 is actually to sack itself off after the knight develops, let's say to d2. The queen doesn't really look directly now at the e3 square, and now the bishop sack on e3 becomes a very, very valid option. So bishop c5 is the reason. Also, knight jumping immediately to e5 is not really problematic because it has no targets there. So preventing knight e5 is not our priority at the moment. Also, in several variations, when knight goes to d4, this bishop actually is really helpful in just chopping it off and continuing the attack down the e and the f files. So that's the reason why bishop c5 is played. Let's go through with the most natural moves. Let's say bishop e2, castle, they castle, and now knight to e4. Now knight to e4 is a pretty solid move, as you can see, not because of all the arrows that I've drawn, but it really is a very strong move. The knight on e5 is eventually threatening some dirty business on f2. It wants to sack itself, further weaken this particular pawn, and because of that, a lot of the other options have also opened up. The knight has also cleared the 6th rank for the queen, so the queen can come to g6, sometimes even h6, to gain more access to the king side. And also now these rooks can actually penetrate directly into the position with rook a e8. So all in all, knight e4 is a multifunctional attacking move here. Now let's look at a few ways white can go wrong. The most natural move in this position is knight b to d2. I mean, what can be more natural than this? But it's losing straight on the spot. And it's losing because of two sacrifices. So I'll let you choose which one you want to go to. Knight takes f2 is a decent sack. The idea is if you take with the rook, we take back, and you're losing the rook now. And that seems like a pretty strong position. But what if they take with the king? They can. And after Bishop takes e3, king e1, rook ae8. This is actually a pretty bad position. If you check with the Indian, I don't think that it will show anything below -4 here. So for black, so it's an advantage for black. White basically can't move anywhere, and it should be a pretty simple position. But what I recommend after knight b2 d2 is actually just sack with bishop takes e3. I think it's slightly more straightforward. And after f takes e3, queen takes, we get the pawn back. Sorry, the piece back on e2. So that seems like a slightly more straightforward. Another thing is, which I kind of forgot to say, but I just remembered the line now. After knight takes f2, if the king doesn't take and the rook doesn't take, there is another move, which is knight d4. Kind of tricky, because now the knight is basically not taken, it's hanging now, and if you move the knight somewhere, then the rook and the knight are actually threatening to take out the f5 bishop. But it shouldn't worry you a lot, because there is this move knight d3, which moves the knight while threatening the queen. And after something like bishop takes d3, bishop takes d3, now the bishop is no longer hanging, the rook is being attacked, and after a natural response like rook takes f8 check, rook takes f8, and let's say knight 2 to f3. Here queen h6 is my preferred move. Now this pawn is kind of weak. The queen is looking at the pawn. The rook can actually come to f6 and come over here to h6 when the queen moves, or it can continue to pressurize the e3 pawn after going to e8. This bishop can actually drop back to d6 and help in the attack on the king. And this bishop is very strong already where it is. It's preventing any rook f1 business right now. But even this bishop can reroute itself from e4 to further pressurize that white king side. So all in all, this also seems like a decent position after knight d4. But you can see that after knight e4, the common or the most obvious move doesn't really work. So what's the best plan? The best plan is actually knight d4, preventing any shenanigans on the e3 and f2 squares. So we swing the queen over. The minor pieces are placed as aggressively as possible, and so we just move the queen over. There could be a temptation to save this bishop by going bishop d7, but that's why we have videos like this. We have to understand a little bit of theory. We have to understand that we have to attack, and we have to be quick about it. So queen g6 it is. After queen g6, let's look at the most natural response. At least for me, the most natural will be just to chop off the bishop. Let's chop off the bishop and get over with the attack. White's pieces, minor pieces, look very strong, but if they can't do anything, then they can't do anything. The problem is this doesn't work, because after rook takes f5, obviously now the rook can also come into the attack over here. Knight d2, which is the most common move, actually runs straight into this trap again. The knight takes f2. After rook takes f2, bishop takes e3. Again, there's a lot of problem. The knight can't move because of the bishop, and we are simply going to add more fuel to the fire by bringing the other rook. Something like queen c2 could be played. Another thing is like one thing that people don't understand is I've seen some people play bishop f3 here. It doesn't work simply because of rook takes f3. You can't take with the g pawn because the king is pinned, and you can't really do anything after that. You can't take with the knight because the knight is pinned. With all these pins, I don't really think that you can play a move like this. Queen c2 it is. The idea behind queen c2 is, okay, take the rook, but at least I get some kind of an exchange. But we see that this shouldn't really work. After rook takes f2, queen takes g6, we have this discovered check. Rook takes f2, king f1, rook f2, king e1, and now just take. And yeah, that's just basically a rook down position, and also completely lost. So knight takes f5, despite, at least for me, being the most natural move, doesn't really work. So what can you do if not that? Well, you can play knight d2. Knight d2 should suffice. It's bringing another knight out and not immediately capturing the bishop. But here, white might regret what they have just done, because bishop h3 is a really strong move. Now obviously, here it doesn't really make sense, because we can chop it off, and if they do anything like that, obviously the mate is coming soon, so they can't really prevent the mate through bishop f3. Well, they can try g3, and over here most of us would essentially take the rook on f1, but I suggest we don't do that. Let's first chop the knight. After c takes d4, now we chop the rook. Now we chop the other pawn. After the queen moves to c3, this seems like a very safe place for the queen, trying to protect this particular weak pawn. But over here, I'm just going to show you a sample line which kind of proves the inevitability of defeat for white players in this position. We continue bringing our forces in. Rook a2 e8, bishop g2, king h8. Now, the reason why king h8 is played is essentially to get rid of any bishop takes d5 coming with check. Our attack is in full swing right now, and we are basically going to crash through, and we don't want anybody to spoil the party with bishop takes d5 and giving us a check that we don't really foresee. After rook f1, knight d3. Now the queen is not looking at the pawn, and we are threatening to chop the pawn off. After something like rook f8, knight f3. The pawn is still doomed, but safe for now. Queen e4, centralizing the queen, attacking the knight, attacking the pawn. Queen d2, let's say. Rook takes f3. And yeah, that's basically that. I don't really think that we should go further in this line. So we can't play knight takes f5. We can't also really play knight d2. So what can white do? Well, instead of these moves, white can actually play the best move, which is f4 in this position. f4 is kind of solidifying the king side. The rook is now looking directly at the f4 square, and these knight takes f2 sacrifices have become less toxic now. So we continue with our development rook a8, and let's just develop a sample line with the most natural moves. Let's say knight d2, we chop off the strong knight in the center, and we play b5. And I think this variation is something that should be one of the best ways for white to deal with this variation. But I also think black has a pretty decent idea. So they want to move the bishop and soften up the king side even further. The rooks can actually move up and to the king side. And I think this seems like a decent position. Also, these pawns here that we have, the pawn phalanx on the queen side is pretty strong, and it might grow to large proportions. That's basically it for this particular variation. I mean, something like b3, white should be slightly careful, because after, let's say, something like c3, knight takes, bishop takes f4, you can't take back because of the mate here on g2. So after bishop f3, let's say bishop f3, rook f3, and b4, these pawns can start becoming a real pain point for white if white is not comfortable, if white is not careful. So because of that, I don't really think that this variation is anything special for white, but at least they have avoided all the pitfalls in this particular variation. Now, what's left covering is if we go way back to when we sacrifice the pawn with f6, we have looked at what happens after e takes f6, but just let's quickly look at the other two variations. One of them is knight f3. Now, knight f3 in several positions may transpose directly back into the variations that we just saw after e takes f6. We take the pawn, knight takes back, knight f6, bishop e2, just developing, bishop c5, castle, castle, and if knight goes back to f3, knight e4 is actually the same position that we just saw. right? So that's a direct transposition. But let's say the knight doesn't go back to f3. The other knight can come to d2 at this position. And over here, we can immediately go for the sacrificial line with bishop takes e3. And after, let's say, f takes e3, queen takes e3, rook f2, queen e5. But although in this position, the knights, in this situation, the bishop doesn't have to be taken immediately. The knight's peculiar position on e5 actually arranges a counter tactic, which is knight e takes c4. But over here, I suggest that we chop the knight. And after f takes e3, f takes e3, and rook f2, we simply should play b5. And obviously the bishop can't be taken because of the pin. And I think that this should be a playable position for both the sides, although it's clear that black is the aggressor in this particular position. So that is for the knight f3 line instead of e takes f6. Very similar and has very similar themes to the e takes f6 line. Another independent try is this move, which is e6 over here. Now e6 is independent because a lot of the themes that we have seen with knight f6 aren't really possible immediately. And it seems kind of like those moves where instead of holding on to the pawn, white is giving up the pawn but on its own terms. But this shouldn't also be a problem. Instead of immediately capturing with bishop takes e6, I suggest we first go bishop c5. After knight f3, now we chop the pawn. And after something like bishop e2, okay, we can go knight to e7 in this particular position. But white actually wants to plant the knight to e4. We have seen a lot of the reasons why, because of a lot of these sacrificial ideas. So how do we do that? Well, f5. That should be the plan forward. So after f5, white can castle when we play, and then we play knight f6. Now the problem over here with f5, the obvious problem is that it kind of hinders our bishop here, and the bishop can't really look towards the king side where it was actually causing a lot of chaos there. But this is only temporary, as we'll see. So after something like knight b to d2, we castle, and after the most natural move, which is knight d4, here comes the idea, f4. And now the bishop is free. We are prepared to sack this pawn for just free-flowing development, and it should be very similar to the other themes, but although I think this is much more tactical now. So white wanted to avoid all tactics by going e6, but he's going to get a lot more of that. So obviously, let's say taking the bishop with the knight takes e6 is not really good, because after queen takes e6, there's a lot of pressure on the e3 pawn. And after the e3 pawn drops, the pieces come into life, especially this dark squared bishop. And I really don't think that this should be a position that we should fret playing. So knight takes e6 is not really good. E takes f4, accepting the pawn sacrifice, seems to be the most logical one. And now after bishop takes d4, c takes d4, queen takes d4, the queen is centralized in the middle. It's attacking a lot of soft spots, and I think this should be a decent position for black to play. Let's look at just one of the lines, or let's say a couple of the lines. Let's say g3. After g3, we go with rook a8, bringing the last piece into the battle. And after knight f3, queen c5. And now I'll tell you the reason for the queen c5 variation. Now also, you could have reached something similar if white immediately decided to go like knight f3 here. We again drop back to queen c5. Now the idea is we actually want to prepare these pawn pushes. So we first, let's say, want to go b5, then d4, and bring this rook to e8 to further keep pressuring the white center and the queen side. That's essentially the plan. Let's look at that plan through the g3 move order, which also makes sense. Let's say they keep developing their own pieces, and now we go bishop g4. All right. Obviously, if the knight gets traded or captured, these dark squares in the center become even weak. So, but it's something that white can allow. Let's say queen c3, we take and we go d4. I already start liking this position for black, although computer says it's not winning or anything, but having a clear plan is really important in such situations, because even the computer might say dead draw or equal or slight advantage to white or black or anything like that. For us humans, we don't have that evaluation bar, and we have to keep making moves. And in these quiet positions or strategic positions, it's always nice to know the plans beforehand rather than trying to find them over the board, because okay, you can find them over the board, but it just takes a lot of time. Over here, the black plan is simple: push the queenside pawns and push the central pawns, try to plant the knight somewhere, use both the rooks on the open file, and then basically try to push through. White's plan is much more defensive, and he has to somehow try to break up these pawns with his own pawns like b3 or a4 or something like that. Let's try to see one thing in action. So let's say after queen d2, b5, let's say they play something like b3, which is kind of not like the best move, but it's something which is very natural to play. But after d3, let's say rook ac1, we chop off the rook, d4, now we are actually threatening this. So after queen d2, rook c8, bishop takes b takes c4, b takes c4, and now we see these two beautiful pawns. They are hanging pawns, but they're still pretty strong because they are protected by they're backed up by the rook. So unless we miss some weird tactic or something like that, I think these pawns should be a very strong asset for us to get the victory here. Obviously, black will try to blockade the pawns on the dark squares, but I think we should be able to lift the blockade or at least get some other form of positional advantage. So this is about the e6 line, and I think with that we have covered this entire complex of e5 and bishop takes e5 lines. So in the next video we are going to have a look at the other lines, which is the most common move after e5, which is d takes e5. So that's it for this video, and I hope to see you next time. So if you got some value from that, consider hitting the subscribe button. It really helps me out, and you also get to be notified about the future uploads that I do. And while you're at it, have a look at these other two videos, which I think you might find really interesting. Until next time,